Good evening. You're watching The Urban Debate with me, Aarti Subramanian. America and the rest of the world witnessed unprecedented scenes as the very altar of American democracy came under attack. Capitol Hill was under siege as Trump supporters stormed into the iconic building and ran amok. The events were precipitated after a rally by Donald Trump in which he appeared to instigate and goad supporters to march to Capitol Hill, where the process of ratifying the Electoral College votes were underway. Simmering tension and social unrest boiled over into large-scale anarchy as the National Guard struggled to restore order in the US Capitol. The darkest chapter perhaps in American history, the deepest wounds inflicted on the American psyche. Where does America go from here? And how should India see the events that are unfolding in Washington, D.C.? To discuss that and more, joining me this evening, Gabe Gutierrez, who's senior correspondent with NBC, Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the US and Germany, Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Smita Sharma, senior journalist, Ashok Sanjar, former diplomat, and Narayan Lakshman, who's the associate editor and former US correspondent at The Hindu. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for taking time out and speaking to Mirror Now. Mr. Gabe Gutierrez, if I can just start off with you. America is seen by so many as the beacon of hope, the torchbearer of democracy. To see scenes like we have, which are unprecedented, what does this day mean in American history, and what impact does it have on the very fabric of American society?
Well, thank you for having me. It was an extremely dramatic day yesterday now. The sun has risen here. A curfew was in effect overnight. It was truly just devastating here in the United States. This was actually the first time in more than 200 years that anyone actually breached the inside of the U.S. Capitol. The last time it happened was in the year 1814 during the War of 1812 when the British attacked the U.S. Capitol. If you can see behind me, we're actually in the front of the Capitol here. Behind me, there are armored vehicles here right now from local police agencies in neighboring states. Here in America, there are critics here who wonder what took so long for these reinforcements to arrive. But again, it was an extremely dramatic day. We have been speaking with members of Congress who describe a harrowing, terrifying scene when these protesters, rather rioters, came in to the U.S. Capitol and went through the hallowed halls of Congress and went into the House and the Senate and began defacing, breaking through windows. It was just incredible to witness. One woman was shot by Capitol Police. She later died. 3 other people passed away from medical emergencies throughout the day. Overnight here in America, the House and the Senate met once again and ratified those electoral college votes. And it's just been an incredible time here. And the question is, what will happen over the coming weeks? The mayor here of the Washington, D.C. has extended a state of emergency for the next 2 weeks or so through the inauguration. Back to you.
Gabe, we've seen a statement coming in from Donald Trump in which he has promised a smooth transition to power, an orderly transition to power. That statement itself came with a lot of riders. It seemed like a very reluctant statement, a reluctant concession. Do you actually see that orderly transition happening? And what is it that finally made Trump issue that statement?
Well, certainly the president has been under pressure, and I apologize for some of the audio issues. There's a barricade behind me, but I can tell you that the president here in the U.S. has been under extreme pressure over the last few hours. He was actually banned from social media, his account, Twitter and Facebook, because some of his comments earlier in the day were seen as potentially inciting violence. That is the question, how will President Donald Trump, what will be his next move over the coming weeks? But there have been members of his own party, the Republican Party, here in the U.S. that have been extremely reluctant to throw their support behind him now. There were some earlier in the day who were willing to challenge the results of that electoral college. By the end of the day, they had changed their tune. They said, this is un-American. This is not something that we can support. And so now there seems to be a consensus that yes, that Joe Biden is the president-elect and that he will be the president in less than 2 weeks when the inauguration will happen right on these grounds. But certainly, this is not something that we can remember in modern times here in the U.S. and certainly the eyes of the world are watching.
He is increasingly isolated, as you were saying, in his own party. But what happens next? There are calls for impeachment. Is there in the American system, and I'd just like you to explain this for our viewers, because of course it's a very different political system here in India. Is there any way Donald Trump can be brought to book? What are the chances of that impeachment happening? Because we've heard some senators and some representatives from the House talking about it quite vocally now.
And that is a debate that is underway here in America, right? More than 100 both members of the House and Senate now are openly calling for his impeachment, even though he has less than 2 weeks still in office. And they're, right now they're questioning whether that practically is worth it, so to speak, given the previous controversy we have with the previous impeachment effort. But there are others who say, look, this behavior cannot be normalized, that there have to be some consequences here. That is a debate that is playing out over the coming days. It is, again, these are unprecedented times here. There's no real, we're trying to work through this here in America. There's really no game plan or, this is the second day lawmakers were up here late into the night. This ratification of the Electoral College came in roughly around 4 a.m. time here on the East Coast of the United States. Again, there are still some of the president's actual supporters here. We just spoke with them that are here in Washington that were part of this rally that later turned violent. There were some still of his supporters who still feel that this election was stolen from them. The president, as you know, has been repeating these baseless claims of voter fraud. There is no evidence to suggest that voter fraud actually happened here in the United States, but his supporters just don't see that way. They will follow whatever he has to say, despite what he says. And there are genuine concerns here, especially as the inauguration gets closer and closer. Security will have to be increased here. But right now, we're just waiting to see how this transition of power will happen. As you mentioned, the president just this morning releasing that statement saying there will be an orderly transition of power, but still saying that he does not agree with the election results. When you think about it, here in America, that is just a staggering claim. And it is really starting to sink in here for not just the president's supporters, but also many of his opponents in the Democratic Party. The American political system was dealt a severe blow yesterday.
Well, certainly, I think it's a staggering outcome. It's a staggering situation, not just in America, but the rest of the world, where everybody, is watching this in shock and horror almost at the events that have been unfolding. Gabe, I know you have to go, but just very briefly, one last question before I let you go. There is, as you were saying, you were speaking to Trump supporters. They still seem to believe that this election was stolen from them. But in the Republican Party itself, we've seen people rallying on the other side. They've actually switched sides and said, no, wait, backing Trump was a wrong decision. We're going to switch sides now. Do you think perhaps miraculously this episode has somehow reduced the bipartisanship that we have seen that has divided America?
And that is the major question, isn't it? It's at the start of yesterday, in some ways, this was going into the ratification of the Electoral College vote. There were several U.S. senators and and quite a few Republican members of the House that were prepared to challenge this. I think looking at these pictures that have ricocheted across the world of this violence at what one senator called the temple of democracy here that has been desecrated really has caused some of the Republican members of the House and Senate, conservative members, to really question their support for not just Donald Trump, but what the Republican Party has become. We have been covering the president's rallies for several years. And of course, during the 2016 campaign, the president tapped into this populism here in this country. And it was a populism that really was frustrated with the establishment, with the status quo. But this has been something that had been building here in America for many years before that, through the presidency of Barack Obama. Also, the Tea Party movement, which happened in the late 2000s, dating back for a number of years. And Donald Trump seemed to be the catalyst, and he tapped into that energy. The question right now is for the conservative Republican Party in this country, will it stay intact? Will it splinter into a more far-right wing, perhaps? That is the tug of war that is happening right now and is playing out, unfortunately, many feel for America on the international stage. You are watching this in India. Of course, the world is watching. That will be the question. Even if Donald Trump leaves office and there is an orderly transition of power, how will he remain in the American political system? Will his followers continue to support him? And then, of course, there's the question. There's speculation that he could run again for office in 2024. So certainly a lot of questions to watch over the coming days, weeks, and even years, again, as the American political system was dealt just an incredible blow yesterday. But again, House members and senators felt it was important to work through the night to certify this electoral college vote and prove to voters here in the United States and really around the world that democracy here is alive and well.
Well, Gabe Gutierrez, thank you so much for that. Perhaps that is a silver lining in all of this, that democracy is still alive and there is developed a certain sense of bipartisanship as a result of this. Meera Shankar, if I can come to you. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for waiting very patiently. Meera Shankar, like I was saying, America is seen by so many as the beacon of democracy. And even in protests, which you've seen in Hong Kong, for example, pro-democracy protests carrying the American flag. How do you think the world is going to react? How do you think the world really sees events like this unfolding, which is an attack on the temple of democracy, which is a desecration of democracy?
Well, obviously, I think there's a sense of shock and deep concern, which you can see all around the world, because America has always, been a beacon for democratic values. It's the oldest democracy. It has a written constitution, and it has a long tradition of always having a transfer of power peacefully after voting by the electorate to choose their president and their government. This is the first time that the results of the election have not been accepted, that there has been an unlawful effort to try to subvert the results of the election, that it has really gone beyond any constitutional practices and provisions, and it has actually been against the very basic principle of democracy, which rests on the peaceful transfer of power, that one government wins, one government loses, and that transition takes place peacefully. I think we have to also accept that the process itself has also revealed some of America's institutional strengths, and that is, 60 cases being thrown out by the courts, even by those courts where a majority of the judges were Republican appointed, including the Supreme Court. The certification of the electoral process after the votes were counted, despite pressure on the electoral officials by President Trump, and the certification of the state-wise results by the governors of the states, including Republican majority governors, Republican-ruled states. But at the same time, I think it revealed a horrible vulnerability and weakness, and that is, despite knowing that the results of the elections were that Joe Biden had won, the Republican Party pandered to Trump's personal weaknesses and virtually, encouraged him as he kept denying and was in a state of delusion.
Right.
So I think both have been revealed in this process.
True. Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, all the focus is obviously on Donald Trump. Does the entire blame for this episode and for the years that we have seen, which are very deeply divisive, does it rest entirely on his doorstep? Or in a sense, have the fault lines in America always been this deep and is just perhaps coming to the boil now?
Well, certainly, President Trump used the fault line that you are talking about to create a polarization that swept him to power in the last election. Don't forget, he got more popular votes this time than he got last time, which means that his support base has actually increased.
True.
It's another fact that, of course, Joe Biden has got more votes, popular votes than him, and that's why he won. And of course, the American electoral college system is a complex, how it has a historical background, and it would perhaps be good. I mean, this is my personal view, that they should switch to a direct election and the popular vote rather than this. But then it has a lot of historical background as to give certain powers to certain smaller states so that the bigger states don't dominate, etc. Now, the question is that what will happen now? I mean, I think the polarization is there and it has actually increased. So what impact does it have? And I think Joe Biden will have his hands full in trying to heal the wounds, as we say. And it is clearly a very sad day for the USA when you have these lumpen elements invading the parliament building, etc. But one more thing that I want to say before I conclude is that the Republican Party will have to do a lot of soul searching. And I think they have to regain the public sort of space, the space that they have always occupied in a positive way. And this does not help them at all. And I think this is going to be a great, after Biden comes in, they'll have to go back to the grassroots and work again to create the public perception, the positive public perception.
Yeah, let me actually take that to Narayan Lakshman. Ms. Lakshman, where does America go from here? How do you heal wounds that are like this? And the challenge is, of course, that Joe Biden is going to have to inherit a country as fractured and broken as this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this has been a long time coming, although the events of the last 24 to 48 hours are shocking. This has been coming for the best part of 4 years in the sense that some of your panelists alluded to, which is the bitter polarization. It has taken on racial undertones. You saw the outpouring of anger over the George Floyd killing and the protests after that and the crackdown by the authorities. So there's a lot of resentment and hate. And, I was there even during the Obama years as a correspondent. I could see and feel, talking to people, how much difference there was in worldview between the two Americas that exist today. So I think even though President-elect Biden has won resoundingly and his results have been certified, it is going to be something that he wrestles with throughout his presidency. And trust me, when you have more than 70 million people voting for someone like President Trump, they are going to make their voice heard for the remaining 4 years as well. And I think the rest of the world should be prepared for that in whatever way, shape or form it manifests. And the next election that America has will also hear that voice taking center stage in a way.
Ashok Sajjanal, let me just take off from what Ms. Lakshmana has said. Does Donald Trump represent then the manifestation or the symptom of a larger disease than not being the disease himself? Is he just representative of these troubles that are plaguing America but are not spoken about or have not blown up in everyone's face like this?
Yeah, I think to an extent you are right. Although I would like also to say that it was, a lot of it had to do with Donald Trump's persona itself. Because of what he is. He's an angry man. He's very insecure. He is competent in some ways, but very incompetent in other ways in terms of he's never been, groomed in politics, so to say. He's an outsider. And so, and that was quite visible when he came to the White House in terms of how he conducted not only the country's foreign policy, but also domestic politics in terms of dealing with groups. The other is in terms of, when we are talking about this fractured polity in the country, that has been visible. I don't think it is something that Donald Trump has bequeathed to the country. It was always there. For instance, you would have seen the 2 terms that Mr. Obama was in office, and there were elements in the society which were so aggrieved and they wanted to sort of take America back after his 2 terms were over. So I think there is this racial divide, definitely. But I don't want to sort of, overstated, because I think whether it is racial divide or it is the minority immigrant communities, I think many of them have also, well, let's say in Florida, Trump won Florida, and you have the minority Hispanics there in large numbers. So I think what Mr. Trump really represented was that he gave a voice to the economically disenfranchised polity of the country. What is known as the Midwest, as the Rust Belt, that the white non-college going, non-graduate, lesser educated and lesser in terms of economic pecking order. I think that is the voice that he tapped into in 2016 when he came, by terming China as the currency manipulator, stealing jobs from the United States, Mexico stealing jobs. So I think he was able to touch a very sensitive nerve, correlate with them, establish a rapport with this particular community. And I think many of his policies, I would say that, if COVID had not happened, and maybe the Black Lives Matter, the racial tensions that took place, I think if we were to take what happened, let's say on the 15th of January, when he signed the phase 1 deal with China, the economy was doing very well. I think across the board, people were very happy. So it is his undoing has been that he has totally mismanaged, both in economic terms, health terms, social terms, the challenge that has come as far as the coronavirus pandemic is concerned, and that has been his undoing.
Smita Sharma, would you agree with that? It was just the handling of COVID that has been his undoing and not the preceding 4 years? Because some people might say, and I know it's become a very popular term that has been associated with Donald Trump, it's called a dog whistle. He sends out these messages to his supporters that are not directly asking them or goading them on to action. But the subtext is very clear, in which he's saying, go ahead, go on the rampage.
Aarti, I think it's not about nuance.
Sorry, Meera Shankar, I'm just going to come to you in exactly 1 minute. I just need to get Smita Sharma as well, who's been waiting very patiently.
No, Aarti, I think there's no nuances in Trump's dog whistle. I mean, he is as clear as it gets when he goes out there. And, if you look at, there were innumerable stories. If you look at the social media rooms, the echo chambers of Trump supporters, there were constant messages that called 6th of January as the day of reckoning, when they were given marching calls to go and stop them from stealing the vote. So not once had he actually been nuanced about it. So for me, the worry really from these images is also the way the security guards, handle these protesters, these rioters and the mobs, because that's something that the security agencies will really need to look into. It's been a conversation issue in social media that if only these were black protesters as part of the Black Lives Matter, perhaps there would have a way more disproportionate use of force. Compared to these images where some of the policemen were actually offering their hand to help, in fact, some of the protesters actually walk down the steps. But I think, Aarti, what is important also here is, to some of your earlier questions on this divisiveness of Republicans and whether it will be a forced united house now, I really don't see it. I think the Republicans themselves will have to realize that it's not the old Republican Party anymore. It's become Trump's Republican Party. Republicans have had their fair share of controversy in the past presidents. If you look at a Richard Nixon with the Watergate scandal, if you look at a Ronald Reagan, of course, between India and the Indira years, there was much to be spoken about. George Bush, who went forward with his neocon policies, the foreign invasions to externalize the domestic problems. All of these presidents today are not a patch when it comes to the controversial Donald Trump, who I firmly believe, of course, it does not matter to him that today's legacy has actually created this national tragedy that has been spoken about, or this black chapter in American history. His eyes are set on the next rerun that he possibly may go on for in 2024, midterms in 2022. I mean, most of today, Mike Pence may actually put out a statement. It's too little, too late. These people have been a part for the last few weeks, every time Donald Trump has gone out there and given a call for sedition, literally, to his supporters. So I think the Republicans themselves will have to really look inwards and see where they have landed themselves to.
Perhaps they've all been complicit in their silence, but what does all of this mean for India? Just before I go to that, for all of viewers who are joining us, there were unprecedented scenes in America, no doubt, but there was a starting point for this, and that was a rally that Donald Trump held in Washington, D.C., where he almost goaded on people saying, I know you're going to be marching to Capitol Hill, and I know we're not going to allow, you're not going to allow this election to be stolen. Very briefly, let's just listen to what Donald Trump said that perhaps was a starting point of all of this.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about. And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard today. Today we see a very important event, though, because right over there, right there, we see the event going to take place, and I'm going to be watching because history is going to be made. We're going to see whether or not we have great and courageous leaders or whether or not we have leaders that should be ashamed of themselves. Throughout history, throughout eternity, they'll be ashamed. And you know what? If they do the wrong thing, we should never, ever forget that they did. Never forget.
And that in many ways was what Smita was explaining to be a dog whistle, goading people on without actually telling them directly, call for action. Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, I just want to focus on India now because we've been seeing a lot of commentary on social media, political comments, these doomsday comments almost that in India we could see a similar possibility. The protests could get out of hand and we are going to see such ugly scenes. Do you think these worries are overstated and completely unwarranted, or do you feel there's any legitimacy in these concerns?
Well, when in democracies you will have agitations and protesters, and when it, you never know when it gets out of hand, and it all depends on the law and order management forces. And so far, we have not allowed them to, for example, take the Kisan rally. It's been dealt with properly. People have got the space to protest, yet they have been restrained and constrained to a particular area, which is what normally happens in a democracy, that of course you have the right to protest, but you cannot disrupt things in a manner that, you destroy the daily lives of ordinary people. So you are given a place to protest and you stay there and you make your points. Government maybe, as in the Kisan rally, they are discussing with them. There were several rounds of meetings. I think that's a proper democratic process. But if it gets out of hand, then of course things will happen, like it happened in Capitol Hill yesterday. So I don't think so it's a delicate matter how you handle these protesters. I'm not comparing the kind of protests that have happened in the US and with India, but India has a different society. It has a different temperament in terms of protest. But yes, protests can get out of hand, and it has done in the past. It depends how the government handles it. And I think the narrative that President Trump was sort of promoting, the so-called dog whistle narrative, his supporters have been fed on that narrative for a fairly long time. So they knew exactly what he was trying to tell them. And they did what he wanted them to do, to make a point. Not that I think in his heart of hearts, he knew that he would get away by annulling the election. I don't think he realizes that. He ever thought that he would get there. But I think he's made his point. He's basically rallied his supporters again. And let's see. I mean, if he comes back to fight another election, who knows what will happen.
Meera Shankar, you want to come in on that? You want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think that, what President Trump has done is clearly unlawful. It is ultra-constitutional, and it is against the basic principles of democracy. So at some level, in the traditional Republican Party, I think Trump will become toxic. There are questions now about what to do with him. Should there be accountability? Should Amendment 25th Amendment be invoked by Mike Pence? The House Judiciary Committee has said that Mike Pence should invoke it. They've passed a resolution. The National Association of Manufacturers have asked Mike Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment, which would mean setting the president aside on grounds that he is unable to discharge his duties and the vice president taking over. For this, he would need a support of the majority of the cabinet. I'm not saying this will happen. What I'm saying is that these are issues which are being discussed, and there will be differences of opinion on whether, getting stuck on imposing accountability on President Trump will sidetrack from Biden's agenda and priorities and therefore should not be done, or others who feel that it would be important to set an example so that this doesn't happen again, and that it also would preclude the possibility of his running again. So I would not be so sanguine about his being able to run again. I do see that he's going to be involved in a lot of law cases which are already pending in New York and other areas, even without this issue, this fundamental issue on his taxes, on violation of electoral funding laws, on fudging the accounts of his company. There are many issues on which there are cases already pending, and he was protected from prosecution and punishment during his presidency. So I don't see that it's all going to be so easy for him to continue to have this kind of grip on the Republican Party. After all, if you look at the number of congressmen and senators who were earlier saying they will oppose, they will, voice their opposition to the certification of the votes in the, states, the swing states, and then the actual number who spoke, because by then the Republican Party itself had come together to say this is not on. And Mitch McConnell, for instance, the Senate Majority Leader, decided that there would be no debate in the Senate, that if those who were opposed, could signal their opposition by voting no. So he didn't allow any debate in the Senate at all, which is something you would not have thought of. Others like Lindsey Graham, who were very much, with Trump, finally said enough is enough. And even though he's had a very good run with President Trump, he can't support him on this. So there is a very fundamental question here. It's not, just a routine, he's made a dog whistle or that. This is a very fundamental assault on the U.S. Constitution.
True, Mr. Lakshman. Now this, of course,
a question which will engage people. How are they going to deal with it? Are they going to ignore it? Are they going to seek accountability? If there is accountability, what kind of accountability? And what will that do to President Trump's future fortunes? But what I do not have a doubt about is that the constituency, which in a sense propelled Donald Trump to power, is still very much there. Those impacted by globalization, those who lost jobs or whose wages were undercut, and who felt that their voices were not being heard in
Yes,
Washington
true.
by the traditional
Meera
elites.
Shankar, I
So
apologize. I am so sorry for interrupting there, but we just have some news in that Mark Zuckerberg has said that Instagram and Facebook will block Trump from using both forums permanently. So that's going to be interesting because he's used social media very well to his advantage to send out that message. So it's interesting that Mark Zuckerberg saying he's going to be banned permanently. Narayan Lakshman, Meera Shankar has raised a number of issues about what today's events mean for the Republican Party, for American polity and, society in general. But whatever happens in America, for better or worse, affects the entire world. Now, how does this event and these events that are unfolding, what impact is it going to have on India in terms of its engagement with the US?
I think that's a very important question, Aarti, because as Ambassador Shankar said, there is going to be an impact of Trumpism well beyond the time of Trump himself. And that manifests in a couple of important areas, one of which the ambassador highlighted, which is the economic insecurity that a lot of, white middle-class Americans have faced, blue-collar workers across the country have faced, including, for example, in the Rust Belt states. Jobs have been lost to offshoring. So these are, very painful economic touch points that President Trump managed to masterfully tap into. And he played it to great advantage throughout the 4 years, in fact, even before in his 2016 campaign. So I think that is one area where President-elect Biden, however liberal his views and whatever his views on continuing the globalization agenda, he's going to have to put some sort of speed breakers if he wants to build bipartisan consensus within the United States. He cannot afford to isolate or alienate, well over 70 million people who voted for Mr. Trump and their worldview. So, America's engagement in terms of trade and investment is one important area. The second very important area is immigration. Now, this has been, as all of our panelists here will agree, it's an extremely contentious issue. It comes up in term after term, president after president, and sometimes progress is made, but sometimes, like, for example, the comprehensive immigration reform under Obama, it doesn't take off. So that is going to continue to be a very big touch point, and I think Trump's footprint is going to stay on the landscape. His footprint was America for Americans, or American jobs for American people. So that echo is going to carry on for many, many years. And for example, with regard to the H-1B or the green card quotas that you have per country, all of these things are going to be impacted. And we actually have proof that President-elect Biden is already listening to some of the things that happened on the campaign. So for example, with regard to China, President-elect Biden was far more sort of open to the idea of having a negotiated outcome on many aspects of the engagement with China, including on COVID. But as President Trump upped the ante, as he turned up the temperature on COVID and calling it the Wuhan virus, President-elect Biden started changing his own sort of viewpoint on it and his stated agenda in terms of how to deal with COVID, how to tackle it, how to talk about China in that context. So in many regards of foreign policy, economic policy, and immigration policy, you are going to see big changes, and all of these will affect India in some way or the other.
Well, it certainly was. In fact, just for all our viewers, the statement from Mark Zuckerberg, in fact, I just want to correct myself there. It is actually the statement says, and Mark Zuckerberg's the statement says, we're extending the block we've placed on his Facebook and Instagram accounts indefinitely and for at least the next 2 weeks until the peaceful transition of power is complete. So I just want to correct myself that, in fact, it's not permanently. Mr. Sajana, do you want to come in on this? Mr. Lakshman was speaking about how the events are going to affect America's relationship with China and, of course, consequently with India as well.
Yeah, no, with India, I'm not so very sure, but I think the global image of the United States, that definitely has been dented, in my view, because right now when we've been talking about the contestation and the confrontation between the United States and China, it is not only as far as power is concerned, it's not only trade, it's not only technology, it's also a contestation of the systems of global governance, democracy versus authoritarianism, the sort of economic policies that they follow, the economic policies that are followed in democracies, and what China has been telling itself, the world, and through its BRI and all the other endeavors that it has been engaging in, that its system is much better. It yields much better results. You look at what is happening in United States, the most prosperous, the richest, the most powerful country, how they have not been able to deal with the COVID-19, how they have not been able to deal with the economy and the social tensions. Similarly, as far as Europe is concerned. So obviously, we have been able to handle it much better. So our system is much better. So I think this is a contestation between the United States and China on multiple levels. And what has happened in the United States yesterday definitely has brought down the attractiveness and the viability, sustainability of democratic system a notch or two. Let me also come in on one or two of the other things that were mentioned. 75 million people have voted for Mr. Trump in the presidential elections. Now, let us see how many of them really continue to stick with him after the transfer of power takes place on the 20th of January. As many of the panelists have been saying, all the diehard supporters of Mr. Trump, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz, Mitch McConnell, etc., I think slowly and gradually they are deserting that ship. I think all these people also, because Trump had the authority of the White House, he had the megaphone to sort of address, and anything he would say, would tweet, this would be lapped on by the media, either criticized or otherwise. But when he is out, he does not have the benefit of the pulpit of the White House and the government or otherwise, even globally, internationally. People are not really interested in what he's saying. I don't know how much of the support of this 75 million people that he will be able to carry with himself. Globally also, I don't think his voice will really carry all that much. I'm sure he will try to do, but the Biden administration also, I'm confident, will make sure that he is engaged in so many lawsuits that he doesn't have time to do anything else, in terms of challenging or in terms of coming up with alternative narratives. Now, as far as India is concerned, what Mr. Biden is looking for is building alliances. And I'm sure the sort of, as the administration comes in, they will also see, the United States of today is not the United States of 2016 when Mr. Biden was the vice president. The whole geopolitical scenario has undergone tumultuous changes. And Mr. Biden will have to come to grips with it, have to come to terms with it, because it is a direct challenge. So his style might be a little different. It might be more in terms of, working through alliances with Europe. Europe has now entered into a major investment agreement with China. So I don't know how far that will go. I think the biggest partner that the United States will find, that Mr. Biden will find, if it has to take on China, will be India. So I think on all broad, whether it is defense, whether it is energy, across the board, I think the cooperation is only bound to grow and get better. Aarti.
Smita Sharma, do you agree with that assessment? And are there any lessons for India in all of this?
Aarti, it's interesting you asked me this question, because last night, as these horrific images were playing out, I in fact tweeted to say that, India, see, learn, and my Twitter timeline has been completely messed up since then.
In fact, I was going to ask you about that, Smita Sharma. I just actually wanted to mention that that particular tweet of yours has been rather controversial and gained quite a bit of traction.
I mean, good. I can only offer them some bernol because, that's what trolls do. Most of them start boiling up and down on your timelines. But, this is also actually originating from a fact, to a question that you asked earlier, in fact, to Ambassador Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti. And I would just like to comment on that because I think it's a little unfair to be comparing the farmers' protests with these riots that happened in Capitol Hill. I mean, the farmers have been agitating about farm bills that were legislated, and they alleged that they did not have consultation with the stakeholders, with farmers. But here you have mobs rioting in the parliament because they believe that an election result is completely based on fraud, whereas they really have no legal or any empirical evidence to prove this. The election results have been upheld. The results have spoken for themselves, be it the popular votes or the electoral college votes. World leaders have, of course, congratulated Joe Biden over the past few weeks. So to try and still stoke fires on those results, calling them fraud, and then for these mobs to go inside parliament, where you saw those images of, congressmen actually having to take shelter under the benches, I don't think it's a fair comparison. And, also because the other question that you asked in the beginning, Aarti, and I'll just end my comment with that, where you said that was Donald Trump merely, did he symbolize a deeper malaise? Look, every democracy has problems. All countries have fault lines. India too has various fault lines. But that's where the question of leadership comes in. To ask how much do you legitimize, how much do you help deepening those fault lines further? I mean, in India, a lot of people will say, yes, there was cow vigilantism that was happening earlier too. But the cracking down, the legitimizing of the cow vigilantism, that will depend on which government, in which state, in which center. That's where the tests for leadership lie in. And so what Donald Trump has done today has made, I think, the autocrats of the world look so much better, including be it a Vladimir Putin to a Xi Jinping to Turkey's Erdogan, keeping in mind that even Turkey had some real words, strong words of condemnation for the US today.
Smita, very briefly, just one counter question to you. You speak about electoral fraud in the United States, obviously nowhere to the same level. But even in India, unfortunately, we've seen a number of people question Indian democracy, saying, oh, democracy is in danger, EVMs are hacked, raising aspersions on an electoral process that has time and time again been the very heart of our democracy, that has proven itself over and over again.
That EVM fraud question, I think that needs to lie to rest because, we have seen election results, of course. It is an issue that the opposition has tried stoking every time it thought that it is losing or it actually lost. And it's really a non-issue. My tweet today about India learning from the process was that, of course, as a democracy, we need to be careful because, the people who are abusing me need to realize today that it's not like there were mobs ruling the streets of America for the past many decades or America wasn't really used to all these kind of violent elections for decades, which is why this should have been expected, whereas everything has been hunky-dory with India. I mean, democracies need to be careful because we are living in different times globally, the kind of governments that we are seeing across different countries, and we need to make sure that our institutional strengths remain so that we do not fall into and witness such kind of a black day for our own political histories.
Meera Shankar, I'm unfortunately completely out of time, but very briefly, I want to give you the final word on this debate, on the impact that this is going to have on India, not just in terms of its engagement with the United States, but also if these divide that we're speaking about, these fault lines in American society are as bad as they are perhaps, or we're way better off in India compared to what is happening in the United States.
Well, I think Indian politics too is a bit like the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American politics. It's competitive politics and sometimes very fiercely competitive, leading to divisions. There are other models, and perhaps we have to look at some of those more carefully. For instance, there's the German model, which evolved basically after the terrible experience of the Second World War and Hitler's leadership. And this is one which is much more consensual, which works on the basis of labor and industry working together, government and opposition parties working together, and really creating a much more consensual society with power which is dispersed federally, all across Germany. It's not concentrated, whether it's economic activity, it's widely dispersed. Whether it's political activity, it's widely dispersed. Very strong city leaders who have sometimes 7-year terms and then go on to become chancellors. So maybe we need to also look at how we can also not necessarily have really do or die kind of politics, which is so competitive, but how we create national consensus, at least on core issues.
Right. Mr. Chakravarti, your closing comments?
I think I don't think we have got much to learn from the USA as far as these incidents are concerned. We have handled protests, we have handled disparate groups in India, and I think India is a far more diverse country than the USA. So I'm not worried about democracy in India. I think we will be able to manage it because we have a system which has been robust. We have a system which has worked for so many years. But in democracy, there are always dangers because you have certain freedoms which can sometimes lead people to cross certain lines, and which does create problems. But I think democracies, America is a strong country. I have no doubt it will come back to normal, be able to handle its protests, etc. So I don't think we should get overboard on it. America will certainly settle down, and when the new administration comes in, and they are experienced people. I think Joe Biden is not like President Trump, who has parachuted into politics. He's been senator, and he's got a long history of politics, and he knows how to create consensus. So I'm not so worried about what happened today in the USA. It's bad, of course, and not good for their democracy, but I think they will settle down.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a very engaging discussion. It's been a very enlightening discussion. The scenes that we saw in Washington, D.C. yesterday, perhaps and hopefully we will never ever see in any other part of the world where democracy's temple, where the edifice of democracy really is broken in many ways like that. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Plenty of lessons to learn, perhaps in India as well, where we have to guard against this kind of deep division that has gripped America. We're going to slip into a short break. Plenty more on the other side, so stay tuned.